The morning mist of September 26, 1918, hung like a shroud over the Argonne forest as General John Joseph Pershing stood atop a hilltop observation post, his weathered hands gripping a pair of field glasses. Through the gray dawn, he could see the largest American army ever assembled, preparing for what would become the bloodiest battle in United States military history. Over 1,200,000 American soldiers stretched across a 24-mile front, their steel helmets catching the first glimmers of sunlight breaking through the French countryside. "Today, we write history," Pershing muttered to his aide-de-camp Colonel George Marshall, whose own destiny would later shape a different war. The weight of 4 years of European carnage pressed upon every decision, every breath taken in those crucial moments before the artillery would thunder to life. Across the battle lines, German Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria commanded the opposing forces with the desperation of a dying empire. His Hindenburg Line, a masterpiece of defensive engineering stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border, represented Germany's final hope of avoiding total defeat. Machine gun nests carved into hillsides, barbed wire entanglements deeper than a man could leap, and artillery positions registered to every possible approach created what German commanders believed was an impregnable fortress. The Argonne forest itself seemed to conspire against the advancing Americans. Ancient oak and pine trees, twisted by centuries of growth, created a natural labyrinth where battalions could disappear without trace. Ravines carved by forgotten streams offered perfect concealment for German defenders, while the thick canopy above made aerial reconnaissance nearly impossible. This was not the open warfare that American doctrine had prepared for, but rather a return to the savage, intimate combat that had characterized the earliest battles of human civilization. As referenced in the comprehensive military archives of the National World War I Museum and Memorial, the strategic importance of this offensive cannot be overstated. The Meuse-Argonne sector controlled the vital railway lines that supplied German forces across the Western Front. If American forces could sever these supply arteries, the entire German defensive system would collapse like a house built upon sand. Private James Walker Thompson of the 77th Infantry Division checked his Springfield rifle for the 100th time that morning, his hands trembling not from fear but from the coffee substitute that barely resembled the real thing. Around him, soldiers from every corner of America prepared for battle. Farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, recent immigrants from Ellis Island who barely spoke English but understood perfectly the meaning of freedom. Their uniforms, still creased from recent issue, would soon be stained with the mud and blood of the Argonne. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Whittlesey, commanding the 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry Regiment, studied his maps one final time. The penciled lines and tactical symbols seemed inadequate to represent the complexity of the task ahead. His orders were simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Advance through the forest, capture the German positions and maintain the momentum of attack, regardless of casualties. The German defenders knew they were coming. For weeks, reconnaissance flights had observed the American buildup, and captured prisoners had revealed the general outline of Pershing's plan. Oberst Wilhelm von Einem, commanding the German forces in the Argonne sector, had positioned his men with the cold calculation of a master chess player. Every tree, every ridge, every stream crossing had been turned into a potential killing ground. At precisely 5:30 in the morning, the earth erupted in fire and thunder as 2,700 American artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously, creating the largest barrage in United States military history. The bombardment that shattered the pre-dawn silence of September 26th could be heard in Paris, 60 miles away. For 3 hours, American artillery pounded German positions with methodical precision, each shell a hammer blow against the anvil of war. Colonel Edward Westcott, commanding the artillery brigade supporting the 1st Corps, watched through his periscope as explosions blossomed like deadly flowers across the German lines. "Lift fire," came the order at 8:30, and suddenly the forest fell eerily quiet except for the ringing in every soldier's ears. This was the moment when flesh and blood would test steel and concrete, when the theories of staff officers would meet the brutal reality of combat. The first wave went over the top with parade ground precision. That lasted exactly 30 seconds. Private Michael O'Sullivan from Boston's Irish Quarter had taken perhaps 20 steps when the machine gun bullets began their deadly harvest. Men fell like wheat before the scythe, their careful formations dissolving into desperate groups seeking any cover the forest might provide. The neat tactical plans drawn on maps in comfortable headquarters became meaningless in the face of German defensive fire. Major Charles White, leading his battalion through a maze of fallen timber and shell craters, quickly realized that the artillery preparation had failed to destroy the German wire. Massive entanglements, some 20 feet deep, forced his men into narrow corridors where machine gunners waited with patient discipline. The Maxim guns, mounted on sledge runners for easy movement, swept these killing zones with mechanical precision that turned brave soldiers into statistics. Through the chaos, acts of extraordinary heroism began to emerge. Sergeant Alvin Cullum York of Tennessee, assigned to the 82nd Infantry Division, would within days become America's most celebrated hero of the war. But on this first morning, he was simply another soldier pushing through the undergrowth, his mountain-bred instincts keeping him alive when military training proved inadequate. The German defense was not passive. Counterattacks came with Prussian efficiency, led by veteran stormtroopers who had survived 3 years of Western Front combat, as documented in the official records of the American Battle Monuments Commission. The first day's objectives were achieved only in limited areas, and at a cost that shocked even experienced commanders. The 28th Infantry Division, composed largely of Pennsylvania National Guardsmen, suffered over 40% casualties in their first major engagement. Hospital trains began running continuously between the front lines in Paris, carrying broken bodies and shattered minds away from the cauldron of battle. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, America's leading fighter ace, flew reconnaissance missions over the battlefield from his French-built Spad fighter plane. Through breaks in the forest canopy, he could see the geometric patterns of American advance. Long lines of men reduced to scattered dots, supply columns struggling through muddy roads churned by constant traffic, and the flash of artillery fire marking the fluid battle lines. The weather, as if responding to human suffering, turned malevolent. Rain began falling on September 27th, transforming the forest floor into a quagmire that swallowed men whole. Supply wagons became hopelessly mired, leaving frontline troops without ammunition, food, or medical supplies. Wounded soldiers lay in shell craters filled with rainwater, their cries for help lost in the constant rumble of gunfire. General Omar Bundy, commanding the 2nd Corps, faced a crisis of command as reports flooded in from his subordinate units. Communications lines, carefully laid by Signal Corps specialists, were severed by artillery fire faster than they could be repaired. Runners carrying vital messages often disappeared into the forest maze, leaving commanders to make life-and-death decisions based on fragmentary and often contradictory information. By nightfall of the second day, the American advance had penetrated barely 3 miles into the German defensive zone, far short of the optimistic objectives set by staff planners. Yet something had changed in the character of the war itself, something that would resonate through the remaining weeks of fighting.
The Argonne Forest had earned a new name among American soldiers by the 3rd day of fighting: the Green Hell. Ancient trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of French kings now sheltered German machine gun nests and American foxholes in deadly proximity. Sergeant Frank Woodfill of the 5th Infantry Division moved through this nightmare landscape with the patience of a hunter, his rifle claiming German positions one by one in a display of marksmanship that would earn him the Medal of Honor. The forest fighting developed its own savage rules, far removed from the textbook tactics taught at West Point. Lieutenant Samuel Parker of the 79th Infantry Division learned to navigate by compass and intuition when his company became separated from the rest of the battalion. Our 48 hours. His 37 men survived on rainwater and field rations while fighting running battles with German patrols that seemed to materialize from the trees themselves. Colonel George Patton, commanding a tank battalion equipped with French-built Renault machines, discovered that armored warfare in dense forest was nearly impossible. His tanks, designed for open battlefield combat, became trapped between trees or mired in hidden stream beds. When Patton himself was wounded by machine gun fire while attempting to direct his vehicles forward, he continued commanding from a stretcher until loss of blood forced his evacuation. The German defense, initially confident in their prepared positions, began to show signs of strain. Lieutenant Huntsmuller, a veteran of Verdun and the Somme, wrote in his diary, "The Americans fight like wild men, with no regard for casualties. They attacked the same position 5 times in one day, and each time we cut them down, more appear from the forest. This cannot continue." His words, later discovered by advancing American troops, captured the desperation that was beginning to grip German defenders. As chronicled in the detailed battlefield reports preserved at the United States Army Heritage and Education Center, the innovative tactics developed during these forest battles would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. Small unit operations, infiltration techniques, and the coordination of infantry with supporting weapons all emerged from the Crow laboratory of the Argonne fighting. Private Harry Adams of the 1st Infantry Division, the famed Big Red One, found himself cut off with 12 other soldiers in a shell crater barely 50 yards from German trenches. For 6 days, this tiny group held their position, surviving on ammunition and supplies dropped by brave aviators who flew barely above the treetops. Their stories, told years later at veterans' reunions, captured the essence of courage that defined the Argonne battle. The medical corps faced challenges unlike any previously encountered in modern warfare. Dr. Jonathan Pierce, attached to the 4th Infantry Division, established aid stations in abandoned German dugouts, operating by candlelight while shells exploded overhead. The combination of high explosive wounds and the gangrene That flourished in the damp forest conditions created medical emergencies. That tested every innovation of battlefield surgery. Communication remained a critical weakness in American operations. Signal Corps personnel, led by Captain Arthur Morrison, strung telephone wire through trees and buried cables beneath shell-torn earth. But German artillery severed connections faster than they could be restored. Carrier pigeons, released from frontline positions, often fell victim to German marksmen who understood the vital importance of cutting American communication links. General Hunter Liggett, commanding the First Army, faced pressure from Allied headquarters to accelerate the American advance. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander, demanded results that matched the enormous resources committed to the offensive. Yet Liggett understood that his green American troops were learning warfare in the most unforgiving school possible, and that rushed attacks would only multiply casualties without achieving strategic objectives. The weather continued to torment both sides. October brought cold rain that turned foxholes into frozen pits and made every movement a struggle against mud that seemed determined to claim everything. Supply problems multiplied as horse-drawn wagons became unable to navigate roads that had dissolved into impassable quagmires. Soldiers went days without hot food, surviving on hardtack and water that tasted of the chemicals used to purify it. Yet something was shifting in the balance of forces, invisible but unmistakable to experienced commanders on both sides. October 2nd, 1918, dawned with a fog so thick that soldiers could barely see their own hands extended in front of their faces. It was in this gray twilight that Major Charles Whittlesey led his battalion of the 108th Infantry Regiment into what would become one of the most celebrated episodes of American military history. Following orders to advance regardless of flanking support, Whittlesey pushed his men deep into German-held territory, unaware that units on his left and right had been stopped by fierce resistance. By afternoon, the fog had lifted to reveal Whittlesey's predicament. His 550 men were completely surrounded by German forces in a ravine that offered some protection, but no possibility of retreat. Private Abraham Kahansky, a Polish immigrant from Chicago steel mills, helped establish defensive positions using the natural contours of the ravine, while German voices could be heard, calling to each other through the surrounding forest. The Germans, recognizing an opportunity to eliminate an isolated American unit, brought up additional forces commanded by Hauptmann Heinrich von Kleist, a veteran of the Eastern Front. Von Kleist positioned machine guns on the high ground overlooking the ravine and began a methodical siege designed to force American surrender through starvation and constant harassment fire. His orders from higher command were clear: make an example of these trapped Americans. That would discourage further offensive operations. Whittlesey, a New York lawyer turned soldier, refused repeated German demands for surrender with characteristic New England stubbornness. His written reply, delivered by a German prisoner under flag of truce, stated simply, "We are American soldiers. We will fight until we are relieved or until we die." This message, radioed back to American headquarters, galvanized efforts to reach the trapped battalion. The siege conditions quickly became desperate. Medical supplies ran out on the second day, leaving wounded men to be treated with torn cloth and prayers. Food disappeared even faster, forcing soldiers to subsist on whatever could be foraged from the forest floor. Water became the most precious commodity, with men licking dew from leaves and collecting rainwater in their helmets. According to detailed accounts preserved in the archives of the National World War I Museum, the psychological pressure on the trapped soldiers was as severe as the physical hardships. German propaganda speakers used megaphones to broadcast surrender appeals in English, often providing accurate information about American casualties that suggested intelligence networks within American lines. Some men cracked under the strain, requiring physical restraint to prevent them from walking into German positions with white flags. Relief efforts began immediately, but faced the same obstacles that had isolated the battalion originally. General Robert Alexander, commanding the 77th Division, launched repeated attacks to break through to Whittlesey's position, but German defensive fire stopped each attempt with heavy casualties. The 107th Infantry Regiment lost over 300 men in failed relief attempts. During the first 3 days of the siege, Private Omer Richards, one of the few remaining carrier pigeons handlers in the isolated battalion, released his last bird with a desperate message. "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." This pigeon, named Cher Ami, flew through German gunfire to deliver the message that stopped the friendly fire devastating Willsie's already decimated force. The German attacks intensified as von Kleist realized that American relief efforts were gaining momentum. Hand-to-hand combat became routine as ammunition ran low and desperate men fought with bayonets, rifle butts, and sometimes bare hands. Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm, commanding a company of Bavarian reserves, led one such assault that penetrated to within 20 yards of Willsie's command post, before being repelled by soldiers who had not slept in 4 days. Wilhelm's diary, found after the war, described the Americans as fighting like cornered wolves, with a ferocity that our men have not encountered since the early battles of 1914. By October 7th, after 5 days of siege, relief forces finally broke through German lines. The cost had been enormous. Of the original 550 men who entered the ravine, only 194 answered roll call when rescue arrived. The rest had been killed, wounded, or captured in what had become a microcosm of the entire Argonne offensive. The legend of Sergeant Alvin Cullum York began on October 8, 1918, in a small valley northeast of Chatelcherry, where the Tennessee Mountain Man would single-handedly change the course of a battle and create one of America's most enduring military legends. York, a conscientious objector-turned-soldier, found himself part of a patrol tasked with silencing German machine gun positions that had been decimating American advances for days. The patrol, led by Sergeant Bernard Early of the 82nd Infantry Division, consisted of 17 men drawn from different companies and united only by their mission to infiltrate German lines under cover of darkness. As they moved through the Predal forest, guided by compass bearings and whispered prayers, none could imagine that their actions would be studied by military historians for generations to come. German defenders, commanded by Lieutenant Paul Vollmer, had positioned their machine guns with scientific precision along the reverse slope of Hill 123. These positions, invisible to American artillery observers, could sweep the entire valley with interlocking fields of fire that made daylight advances suicidal. Vollmer's men, veterans of the Hindenburg Line battles, had turned their positions into small fortresses connected by communication trenches and protected by carefully positioned sentries. York's patrol achieved complete surprise, capturing a German headquarters group including Vollmer himself in a dawn raid that netted 25 prisoners. But their success triggered a massive German counterattack as machine gun crews realized their headquarters had been compromised. In the firefight that followed, American casualties mounted quickly until only York and 7 other men remained effective. What happened next entered American folklore. York, drawing on hunting skills learned in the Tennessee mountains, began systematically picking off German machine gunners with his Springfield rifle. His mountain-bred marksmanship, honed on wild turkeys and deer, proved devastatingly effective against human targets. German soldiers, accustomed to facing troops who fired wildly in the confusion of battle, found themselves confronting a marksman who never seemed to miss. As detailed in the official citation for York's Medal of Honor, preserved in the National Archives, the Tennessee sergeant killed 25 German soldiers and captured 132 prisoners, along with 35 machine guns. These numbers, initially dismissed as battlefield exaggeration, were verified by multiple witnesses and German survivors, who testified to York's incredible performance. The psychological impact of York's feat extended far beyond the tactical situation. German morale, already strained by months of defensive fighting, suffered severely, with stories spread of a single American soldier defeating an entire company. Conversely, American troops gained confidence from tales of their comrades' heroism, proof that individual courage could triumph over seemingly impossible odds. Captain Danforth, York's company commander, struggled to believe the reports filtering back from the front lines. Only when York personally delivered his German prisoners, including for officers and Vollmer himself, did the magnitude of the achievement become clear. York's simple explanation, "I surrounded them," became part of military legend, capturing the essence of American fighting, spirit in 5 words. Meanwhile, other heroes were emerging from the brutal forest fighting. Private Michael Valenti of the 6th Infantry Division earned the Distinguished Service Cross for maintaining communications between isolated companies by crawling through German positions for 3 consecutive nights. His Italian immigrant family in New York's Little Italy would later display his medal, alongside a photograph of the Statue of Liberty, symbols of their American dream realized through their son's sacrifice. Lieutenant Frank Luke, the Arizona balloon buster, dominated the skies above the Argonne forest in his French-built Spad fighter plane. Luke's specialty was attacking German observation balloons. the eyes of enemy artillery that directed devastating fire onto American positions. Flying alone against heavily defended targets, Luke destroyed 14 balloons and 4 enemy aircraft in just 10 days of combat, before being shot down behind German lines. The heroism was not confined to individual actions. The entire 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines, attached to the Army's 2nd Infantry Division, fought a running battle through the Below-Wood sector that lasted 8 days. Major Thomas Holcomb, later Commandant of the Marine Corps, led his men through savage hand-to-hand fighting that cleared German positions tree by tree, rock by rock, until the battalion had advanced 3 miles through what had been considered impregnable defensive terrain. These individual stories of courage began to coalesce into something larger, a transformation of American military culture that would influence the nation's approach to warfare. For decades to come, the citizen soldiers of 1918 were creating traditions and legends that would inspire future generations facing their own moments of crisis and decision. By November 1st, 1918, the character of the Meuse-Argonne offensive had fundamentally changed. The initial American attacks, costly and often confused, had given way to methodical operations that reflected for weeks of brutal learning under fire. General John Pershing, observing from his advanced headquarters near Sully, could see evidence of this transformation in every aspect of his army's performance. The artillery preparation for the November 1st assault represented a quantum leap in American tactical sophistication. Colonel Charles Summerall, commanding the 5th Corps artillery, coordinated 800 guns in a rolling barrage that advanced ahead of the infantry with clockwork precision. German defenders, who had grown accustomed to surviving American artillery attacks by sheltering in deep bunkers, found themselves facing a new level of professional competence that left no place to hide. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, recovered from his earlier wounds and commanding the 304th Tank Brigade, led his armored vehicles through the German defenses with an audacity that stunned both sides. His Renault tanks, no longer trapped by forest terrain, raced across open ground toward Beaugency, their machine guns clearing German positions that had resisted infantry attacks for weeks. Patton himself, standing in the turret of the lead tank despite explicit orders to remain in safety, embodied the aggressive spirit that was driving American forces forward. The German defense, commanded by General Max von Gallwitz, had reached the breaking point. Reinforcements promised by German high command never arrived. At the collapse of Bulgaria and Turkey forced redeployment of reserves to other fronts. Von Gallwitz's men, many of them recent conscripts and recovered wounded, lacked the veteran leadership that had made German defensive tactics so effective earlier in the war. Private James Dozier of the 92nd Infantry Division, one of the African-American soldiers fighting in segregated units, participated in the assault on Hill 155. That exemplified the new American tactical competence. His regiment, commanded by Colonel William Hayward, advanced behind a perfectly coordinated artillery barrage that neutralized German positions with minimal American casualties. The contrast with earlier attacks, where entire battalions had been destroyed attempting similar objectives, demonstrated how much American forces had learned. Intelligence operations, initially a weakness in American tactical planning, had evolved into sophisticated networks that provided detailed information about German positions and intentions. Captain Ralph Van Diemen, directing intelligence gathering for the First Army, coordinated aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations, and captured document analysis to create accurate pictures of German defensive preparations. This information, distributed to attacking units through improved communication systems, eliminated much of the uncertainty that had plagued earlier operations, as documented in the operational records maintained by the Center of Military History. American logistics had also undergone revolutionary improvement. The Light Railways Operating Division, commanded by Major General William Bixby, had constructed narrow-gauge rail lines that brought supplies directly to frontline positions. These railways, built under constant artillery fire by engineer battalions working around the clock, solved the transportation crisis that had limited earlier offensive operations. The medical corps had developed battlefield treatment procedures that saved thousands of lives, while maintaining the combat effectiveness of frontline units. Major Harvey Cushing, the renowned neurosurgeon serving as a battlefield doctor, established forward treatment centers that provided immediate care for head and chest wounds that would have been fatal under earlier conditions. His innovations in trauma surgery, developed under fire in the Argonne Forest, would revolutionize civilian medical practice after the war. German counterattacks, Once formidable operations that regularly drove American forces back to their starting positions now met discipline, resistance from troops who had mastered the art of defensive fighting. The 3rd Battalion of the 28th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Major Robert Patterson, repelled 3 German assaults on Hill 326 using interlocking fields of fire and pre-registered artillery concentrations that turned attacking formations into scattered remnants within minutes. Air superiority had shifted decisively to American and Allied forces. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker, now commanding the 94th Aero Squadron, led formations of Spad and Nieuport fighters that dominated German airspace above the battlefield. German pilots, flying obsolete aircraft with inadequate fuel supplies, could no longer provide effective reconnaissance or ground support for their beleaguered infantry. By November 5th, American forces had advanced over 30 miles from their starting positions, capturing the vital railway junction at Sedan and cutting the primary German supply line to the Western Front. The strategic objective that had justified the enormous cost of the offensive was finally within reach, achieved through the transformation of civilian volunteers into professional soldiers seasoned by the most demanding combat conditions imaginable. November 11th, 1918, arrived with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to mock the devastation stretching across the Argonne forest. At precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, the guns fell silent along the entire Western Front, and for the first time in over 4 years, the sound of birdsong could be heard in the French countryside. General John Pershing stood in the same observation post, where he had watched his army begin its offensive 4 to 7 days earlier. But the man who observed this silence was profoundly changed by what he had witnessed. The statistics of the Meuse-Argonne offensive told a story of unprecedented American sacrifice. 26,277 soldiers killed, 95,786 wounded, and 4,714 missing in action. These numbers, carefully recorded by Graves' registration units, represented individual tragedies that would echo through American families for generations. Yet they also marked the transformation of the United States into a global military power, capable of decisive action on the world's battlefields. Sergeant Alvin York, now America's most celebrated war hero, walked through the silent trenches where German soldiers emerged cautiously to stare at their former enemies. The Tennessee marksman, who had become a legend, found himself uncomfortable with fame, more concerned with the fate of his surviving comrades than with the medal ceremonies awaiting him in Paris. His simple mountain wisdom, expressed in letters home, captured the complex emotions of victory tinged with grief. "We done what we come to do, but the cost was mighty high." The German surrender, formalized in Marshal Foch's railway car in the forest of Compiègne, represented the complete collapse of the defensive system that had held Allied forces at bay for 3 years. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding the German forces that had opposed American attacks, wrote in his final dispatch, "The American offensive in the Argonne has broken the back of our resistance." These soldiers, who seemed so unprofessional in September, had become a military force of the first rank. Major Charles Whittlesey, the lawyer-soldier whose lost battalion had captured American imagination, struggled with survivor's guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Of the 550 men who had entered that ravine in early October, only 194 remained to celebrate the armistice. Whittlesey's medal ceremonies and ticker-tape parades could not diminish his sense of responsibility for those who had not returned home. The forest itself bore witness to the scale of destruction that modern warfare could inflict upon the natural world. Ancient trees, some dating to medieval times, lay shattered by artillery fire that had transformed vast areas into lunar landscapes of shell craters and twisted metal. French civilians, returning to villages that had been battle zones for 7 weeks, found communities that would require decades to rebuild, according to comprehensive post-war analyses conducted by the American Battle Monuments Commission. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had achieved its strategic objectives at enormous cost, but had fundamentally altered the balance of power in Europe. German military capacity had been broken, the Western Front had collapsed, and American military competence had been established beyond question. The United States had earned its place at the peace conference table through blood spilled in French soil. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker flew his final combat mission on November 10th, patrolling German airspace that was now empty of enemy aircraft. The 26 victory markers painted on his Spad fighter plane told the story of American aviation's rapid maturation from a few volunteers in foreign squadrons to a formidable air force. capable of dominating European skies. His memoir, written years later, reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. We went to France as enthusiastic amateurs and came home as professional warriors. General Hunter Liggett, commanding the First Army that had borne the brunt of the fighting, addressed his surviving soldiers in a ceremony that captured both triumph and tragedy. You have written your names in history, he told the assembled veterans, but history will also remember the price you paid. The men who listened to these words, scarred by battle and aged beyond their years, understood that they had participated in events that would shape the world for decades to come. The Meuse-Argonne offensive concluded as the largest battle in American military history, involving more soldiers, consuming more resources, and inflicting more casualties than any conflict the nation had previously experienced. It marked the emergence of the United States as a global military power while simultaneously demonstrating the horrific costs that modern warfare could exact from entire generations. As the survivors began their long journey home, they carried with them memories of courage and sacrifice that would influence American military culture for the remainder of the 20th century. The lessons learned in the forests of France, written in blood and validated by victory, would guide American forces through future conflicts when freedom itself hung in the balance. The Meuse-Argonne offensive had ended, but its legacy would endure as long as Americans remembered the price of liberty and the courage required to defend it.